welcome to the second of the video lessons. We are carrying on our background journey / sort of summary of one potential paragraph, so please don't write too much. Trek safari almost of the Weimar years. Today we're going to be looking at the Treaty of Versailles and the role of the elites and how they arguably contributed to either A, undermining Weimar, or B, the rise of Hitler. Obviously they're linked, but they're ever so slightly different. Now, you will never, as far as I can tell, be able to ever need to list what the parts of the Treaty of Versailles were. Because even if you are going to say Treaty of Versailles helped towards Hitler, I cannot foresee a circumstance when you need to summarise it. So this is for you to visualise the key points and to realise why people were angry. Please don't worry about writing all of this down. Essentially, they lose lots of land, lots of people. They have their military backed, which you can argue for a militarist society, particularly a Prussian-based society, is a sort of a dent to their pride. They had to hypocritically, quote unquote, accept sole war guilt. If you remember, their propaganda and understanding was it was a defensive war. And they had to have crippling reparations, which will cause all sorts of economic problems down the line. Okay, so in reality, it is a devastating piece, but arguably not necessarily one that's entirely unfair. So the big thing to realise is, as mentioned last lesson, the average German did not expect such a brutal piece. Fairly or unfairly, they felt that because of propaganda, because the fact that most of the front lines were still not in Germany, because the fact of they wanted the war to mean something after losing lots of relatives, etc. They kind of bought into the idea that Germany hadn't been necessarily defeated, or at least not destroyed, and this Treaty of Versailles seems a bit excessive. Now that's not fair. In reality, the Germans were decisively defeated, and although yes, they had not entered Germany, it was only a matter of time. And the death and destruction that would bring and also then probably a revolution. It was decided that it's better just to surrender by Hindenburg himself. However, as most things in life, it is not what is true in history does not matter. It is what people believe is true. So people believe that this is an unfair, deeply unfair and dishonourable truth because they have only a limited amount of information. They didn't necessarily realise or appreciate quite how doomed Germany was and quite how close the threat of revolution was. So what emerges at the end of this is therefore there's something called a stab in the back myth. Now this is a word coined by Hindenburg, the same man who said we should surrender to the Kaiser. This argument is very powerful. This is essentially the idea that the soldiers on the front line were fighting bravely. There might have been a defeat or two, a tactical withdrawal, but they were nowhere near being destroyed. And actually, the tide was just about to turn, etc., etc., etc. And instead, what had happened is some people at home, hold that thought, undermined them, made a sort of peace of with the Allies selfishly for their own power. How does that work? Well, they argue that a sort of combination of Jews, socialists, communists, in some readings Catholics, although that quickly gets dropped when the Catholics become a bit more right-wing, people named the November Criminals, this is their collective name, they decided to surrender and also cause all sorts of problems in the communist states, all sorts of revolutions and violence at home, in order to basically force Germany out of the war. So you've got lots of problems here. People are revolting, people are sort of trying to get control, and there are some people who are in the SPD and who are Jewish and who are communists who see this as an opportunity to take control from the Kaiser by having a revolution and making peace. So this image is essentially the soldiers could have won the war had it not been for some selfish Jews, SPDs, Catholic, whoever the November Criminals they want them to be at that one point, surrendering in order so that they can get into power. Okay, they force the Kaiser out, they take over and they surrender, and that's what helps keep them in power. Okay, this is very, very, very important. Now, in reality, this is not fair. There's not fair characterization. But it is useful for people in the army, people on the right, to explain why Germany got defeated. Now, you don't want to see you got defeated because you were militarily destroyed or admit any weakness, but it is a nice, therefore convenient myth. Now, in the year or so after the Treaty of Versailles was signed, the vote for the DMVP, which is a profoundly anti-democratic party, jumps to 14.9%. Okay, this arguably is the result of the myths, and what this basically shows, and that's why I've put it, is actually the Treaty of Versailles is a turning point. The average German buys into democracy in 1918. There's various elections in January, for example, January 1919, where the vast majority of Germans say they like democracy in some form. By 1920, which is a year and a half later, this is already starting to decline. The number of people who vote for parties which were part of the sort of signing of the Treaty of Versailles drops to 44.6% of the vote in the same election. So clearly people are moving away from the parties who originally were about democracy and taking power and being in power and sort of they had to sign the Treaty of Versailles because they had to, and towards more extreme parties, particularly on the right, who say that they will reverse the Treaty of Versailles and that democracy is flawed, and this is perfect evidence of it. So why did this whole thing spread so widely? Well, in reality, number one, the people who are blamed, socialists, Jews, to a less extent Catholics, communists, were people that many on the right and even in the centre disliked. So they're more than willing to buy into this narrative of people because it only confirms their worst suspicions. As well as that, it was a very useful scapegoat, and because it's quite nebulous, what that means is it's quite difficult to quite realise exactly how it causes and what effect it's had. It's quite easy also to blame a lot of things on. I often use the example of immigration or the EU, which people have lots of different views on, but it can be said in certain areas of the press a lot is blamed on it, which is either a little bit more complicated or not necessarily the case. So in reality, because it's possible to blame everything on it. It's easy to blame everything on it, and therefore people do blame everything on it. As well as this, remember that most media is controlled by the rich, controlled by the elites, and therefore leans right wing. And their job, therefore, and their aim is to try and propagate this myth. So they will really sell this idea, develop this idea, and really push this idea on people. As well as that, key individuals, including Hindenburg himself, really push the idea. And as well as that, many Germans were on the front line and didn't really feel like they were being absolutely destroyed. And their experience and memory, and it might be a false memory, but humans are very good at having selective false memories, they does not really make sense and justify the Treaty of Versailles. So they see the stab in the back theory that they could have won the war, or at least could have carried on fighting the war to a stalemate, and then force the Allies to have a white peace, which is no one loses anything, we go back to before. And they think, well, on my part of the front line, we weren't getting destroyed. Actually, that makes a lot of sense. Okay? So, the key things to think about when we're talking about why it spread. It is a convincing argument because it buys into people's experiences, their prejudices, and it is simple. There are important people who want to make it. People buy into it. So therefore, that will help spread it. Now, the impact of the Treaty of Versailles, primarily, if you're looking at quite a basic analysis, is economic base. That's the argument on the left. That the Treaty of Versailles does is it has reparations. Reparations then cause hyperinflation in 1923, which we'll talk about in the next video, which in turn causes the loans. The loans cause the Great Depression because by the loans coming into Germany, the Germans become dependent on them, and because of that, the Great Depression happens, and then because the Great Depression happens, Hitler happens. There is a logic to that, but everyone's going to say that. So if we want to show off, we're going to say, well, that's not entirely true. So for example, the Treaty of Versailles did not necessarily lead to hyperinflation. That was the government in 1923 mismanaging the economy and deciding to print a load of money. There's nowhere in the Treaty of Versailles where it says print a load of money. As well as that, the loans in 1924, which followed that, were temporary. Everyone knew they were temporary. Everyone knew that you shouldn't really just keep borrowing money. That would lead to problems. But the weakness of Weimar, the political inability to make hard decisions that we mentioned last time, meant that no one really could think of a plan that was not involving borrowing lots of money. So everyone knew it was bad to borrow money, but no one really could or wanted to try anything else. So they carried on borrowing more money. So is the problem the loans or is the problem the politics? Yeah? I take a mortgage for my house. Well, in theory, I will take a mortgage for a house at some point. If I borrow lots of money, that doesn't make me bad because I can pay it off and it's probably a good thing in long term. So borrowing money isn't bad. If, however, I borrow lots of money and then buy a load of drugs or something and then spend it all, that is bad because now I owe lots of money and it's not necessarily helpful or good. Yeah, so it's really, really bad to do that. So borrowing loans isn't the problem, it's how you use them and if you're going to use them in a constructive way. You borrow loans to make new factories, the factories make the country wealthier, the country gets wealthier, it can pay back a loan. That's fine. As we shall see next lesson, that's not what they do, but that's not because of the loans, that's because they mismanage it. For me, the major one is this. Before 1919, with the signing of the Treaty of Versailles, it's really hard to get poor people to vote for you if you're right wing. That is the perennial problem. You are a poor German. You may be socially conservative, but in reality, the elites and the DNVP, whose argument is we should go back to hierarchy, we should go back to the way things were, when we had a Kaiser, when we had rich and poor, and the society was unequal, doesn't sell well. What the Treaty of Versailles brings is, and Sam in the back brings, is an issue for the right to really say, vote for us and we will deal with the Treaty of Versailles. And to criticise those November criminals who stabbed Germany in the back. So the key thing, I would say, going through to this one, is actually, before the Treaty of Versailles, there was no reason and no way, and it's the bottom right example, sort of summary as well, no reason to really vote for the right. What it does is it gives them an issue to become populist. It's very important, and all you hear about is the Treaty of Versailles this, Treaty of Versailles that, and poor people can buy into that. And it's very easy to blame everything on the Treaty of Versailles, and it's all going to be great once you finish the Treaty of Versailles. Okay, that's not the case, but it works well to get votes. Definitely better than the other stuff they believe in, which is crazy, sort of conservative and elitist. As well as that, although lots of parties signed the Treaty of Versailles, because the SPD are particularly hated by the press and the elites, there's a lot of emphasis of how this is the SPD in particular's fault. And it makes them look weak and unpatriotic. And never underestimate, many voters for the SPD, or potential voters for the SPD, are working class, yes, but they are also patriotic. And they are also sort of old, sort of traditional socially conservative types. This does not necessarily help their image. The last one is less important, but it's well worth mentioning anyway. In reaction to the Treaty of Versailles, there is an explosion of violence from the right against the betrayers of the November criminals. There is the Kapp Putsch, which is not the Munich Putsch which Hitler did, which attempted to take control of the government, not directly because of the Treaty of Versailles, but definitely inspired by it. As well as that, there's lots of assassinations by something called the consul, like the Roman emperor, the consul organisation, which assassinated a load of people. And what this does, what having assassinations and violence on the street and revolutions, is it further gives this image that democracy is not the best way to run a country. This did not happen under Kaiser. This did not happen under authoritarianism. This did not happen under dictatorship. So actually, many people look at this and go, look at this chaos. Democracy is weak. And they start to buy into the arguments of the right, that actually democracy doesn't work. Democracy only leads to selfishness, greed, and the rule of the mob. And what you need is hierarchy. And what you need is sort of order that a dictatorship gives them. So again, Treaty of Versailles creates a reaction of right-wing violence, which only then entrenches this image that democracy is bad. So now we're going to move on to the elites. The elite, this is never going to be its own paragraph, per se, this part. There is one of the most important paragraphs you must have in every essay is how the elites equal Hitler. Everyone is going to focus on the elites in 1930 to 1933. So this stuff you can use to show actually the damage the elite has done is much more long-term than that. Okay, but also to show the difference and different effects of different elites. So, if we remember from last lesson, under the Kaiser, the elites are in control. They run the state. The Kaiser is one man. He's actually quite a weak leader. And so basically he defers to the army, the judiciary, who are all controlled by the same Junker elite, highly, privately as well, highly educated, not necessarily well educated, but, cultured, etc., etc. Individuals who, and I spelled simplicity wrong there, that's not very good, the same sort of people who are all in the same sort of caste. However, what the Kaiser goes, but technically all those people, all the army officers, the judiciary, the rich, are in their job and own all their land. Now, the KPD is threatening revolution, and revolution is all about taking land and jobs from the rich, throwing them out, and then taking over. Ebert made a compromise that we mentioned last time, which basically meant that all the old people, the old state, the old judiciary, the old army, etc., 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 they all stay in power, and they promise to be nice to democracy. Okay, I'm simplifying, but you get the idea. This means that they stay in the same position. And therefore you have got a group of people who are not pro-democracy in significant areas of political, economic and administrative, i.e. running the state, power. And they will use that consistently to undermine democracy and eventually, directly or indirectly, help Hitler come to power. So what are the views of the elites? Now this is from a lesson, taken directly from the lesson, so hopefully I will not have to go too much on this. It's important to realise that they think life was better under the Kaiser. They are naturally therefore supportive of dictatorship. Very often, not on any ideological level, but just because they think that's a natural way things should go. They are very nationalistic, and a form of nationalism which is about obedience to authority, obedience to the king, and one that's very militaristic as well. They believe in authoritarianism. This is the idea that people are inherently bad, people are inherently greedy and corrupt. They require strong, brutal at times, arbitrary central state run by proper chaps who know what they're doing to make sure they do the right thing. They naturally, because they stand for everything the elite do not, and also they provide an incredible threat to the elite, anti-communist. And they do not get the distinction between communist and socialist. So very often they see socialists just as communists who will do it slightly slower, or at least hiding what they're doing. Okay? They're, as inevitable, they are socially conservative, they like eras of tradition, they do not like so much social change, and they are economically conservative. The biggest thing I really want to sort of summarize is they have no desire to compromise with the state in any way, shape or form, in any meaningful way. They are prepared to bide their time and wait and see what happens. But ultimately, they feel no reason to really try and get on with democracy. They will try and exist outside of it rather than engaging with it. And this is because ultimately they don't feel like they owe anything to democracy. They just sort of carried on existing without any fight or fuss. So they didn't really feel like they had to fight for it, and therefore they didn't really earn it. And therefore there's no real perspective amongst them that they are lucky to still be there. And therefore there's no humbleness, and there's still this sort of contempt for everything. Okay, so it might have done them a bit of good to have a couple of them executed in the streets, and they had to try really hard to justify their position. That may well have meant that they would at least pretend to be involved in democracy. So we're going to focus primarily on a couple of core groups in the elites. First of Hindenburg. Okay, Hindenburg, we've done in lessons, so we're not going to do too much. Big things to remember is he becomes president in 1925. He is expected to destroy democracy, particularly as he stood on the DMVP anti-democratic platform. He does not. He doesn't. His argument seems to be that he has a sense of duty, that he should do the job that the Constitution says, but also therefore that he is not going to actively destroy the Constitution. It also does mean, though, however, he is not going to actively save the Constitution and save democracy. So for as long as democracy can exist on its own merits, he will keep it going. However, when it starts having trouble, i.e. the Great Depression, he has no real compunction to not start undermining it at a moment's notice. I would contend that in the short term, it's not actually bad to have Hindenburg as president. Between 1925 and 1930, he doesn't do anything that particularly damaging to government. Sure, he bans the SPD from being in coalition for a bit, and that's not great. But in reality, he doesn't use Article 48, he doesn't really destroy anything, and in return, many right-wingers start going, actually, maybe we can work with democracy. Okay, they think actually democracy perhaps could work for them. They particularly are more willing to give it a go now that they have the guy at the top is one of theirs. And this is particularly true for the GMVP, who actually join a coalition for a bit. In the longer term, it can be said, as we shall see in future lessons, so I'm not going to go in there, he is not necessarily a good force, and he is instrumental in the decline and the dismantling of democracy, however guilty he is. As well as that, The judiciary, Article 4 to 54 of the Constitution, meant that the judiciary maintained their independence. What that meant is they could not be fired, really, unless there was particular, really hard, inaugural sort of impeachment proceedings, which would never happen. Now, this is probably fair, and you don't want the judiciary worried about the government, but it just basically meant that all these right-wing judges who hate democracy could be as biased as they like, and nothing would happen to them. So they really were biased. They hated the left and they hated democracy. And there's loads of examples you really don't need to worry about so much of them abusing their position and interpreting laws and interpreting events and also giving sentences which are really completely dependent on who the person is. Hitler, for example, was given 9 months for basically treason, which involved the death of police officers. A left-winger, Thackenbach, got 11 years for printing stuff about the government which are bad. Like, it is not fair. Similarly, the Catholic and leader and signee of the Treaty of Versailles, Erzberger and Frederick Ebert, are both seriously liable. They basically say they're thieves and treasonous or traitors, respectively. The judges in both cases are really biased, and even though the evidence is overwhelming that what is said is a lie and it's all libelous, the judges find a way to basically make sure that they neither win their cases, or if they do, it's a Pyrrhic victory where they don't actually win everything. The classic one is to look at who gets a death sentence. 365 right-wing people murder someone for political reasons. One is sentenced to death of that entire chunk, and apologies for the brief break there, Mr. Rain decided to start printing stuff off. So where were we? So yes, 365 murders, one sentenced to death, and that one had his sentence commuted. What that means is, although officially sentenced to death, actually he'll go to prison for life. There are 22 left-wingers who murder someone who is right-wing for political reasons. 10 of them, just under half, are sentenced to death. There is a clear inconsistency and unfairness here. So why is this bad, and why is this linked to Hitler? Well, number one, the government is SPD, at least for the early years. Therefore, when the KPD see this and how unfair it is, they blame the SPD and they see the SPD as complicit. That means partly guilty in this. There's a big refrain amongst the communists that the SPD are almost the worst kind of Germans because they are hidden bourgeoisie conservative sympathisers who pretend to be socialists. So that's number one. That's really bad because, as we should say in the future, the SPD and the KPD, even in the face of Hitler, do not unify and therefore allow Hitler to come to power to some extent. So again, this engenders that division, which is really bad. As well as that, by having such a flexible judiciary and knowing that you can pretty much get away with anything, the right wing are only encouraged to commit more bits of violence, and this only therefore creates more violence. And then if you're an average German and you see life in democracy, now there is more violence. If there is more violence in your world, then you kind of assume this is what democracy is like. And therefore does that thing we've talked about constantly, where it increases cynicism of democracy, increases the negative opinion of democracy, increases the positive opinion of authoritarian dictatorship. What about the army? Army, obviously on the soldier level, they are usually peasantry. The army try to actually avoid recruiting workers who are infected with socialism. But the officers, the people with decision making, are the Junker primarily. They happily destroyed KPD rebellions, and they would even go beyond what the government asked to kill, maim them in the street. They, however, were much worse at stopping right-wing violence. Many of the consul assassins were army officers. They refused to stop a couple of putches and actually were partially involved in Hitler's Munich putsch. So therefore, actually, they play a bit of a political role. Why are they so bad, and why do they cause problems? Well, in reality, because they are so powerful and they have all the guns, and they are a member of the elites, they are, I would contend, are the most important reason why, if you are a Democrat, you cannot undermine and destroy the elite. The judges, if you took away the army, you would have civil servants, judges, and the rich. If you took them on, they fought back. There's only so much they can do. But with the army on their side, that's absolutely key to making sure that if you try and take on any of the elites, the army may get involved and start a coup. So it makes chancellors very, very wary to get involved, and therefore let the elite no matter if they are army or judges or rich, keep their way. As well as that, the army's willingness to use extreme violence against communists, and then the SPD either using Article 48 brackets because he has to end brackets to say that's totally legal, again causes divisions between the SPD and the KPD, which is a problem. It is worth mentioning though, the army does not directly challenge democracy before 1930. So although if we're going to say the army is a problem, it's a longer term problem than necessarily a short term one. Finally, and the last two big groups, industrialists and Junkers, the rich, they provide the money for these extreme right-wing parties, including the Nazis and the DNVP, to keep going. Without the money from industrialist donors, the early Nazi party between 1926 and 1930 simply would not exist. And we're going to talk a lot about that when we talk about the reorganisation of the Nazi party. But just remember that all that reorganisation takes money, and it's from the industrialists in particular that comes from. As well as this, the Junkers particularly, there's a cabal of them around Hindenburg who act as advisors. And these advisors are the one who ultimately help persuade Hindenburg to appoint Hitler, even though he really hates Hitler. As well as that, the industrialists and Junkers are what we can describe as the glue. Judges are Junkers, usually the second sons or third sons. Civil servants and army officers the same. They are all related. They are the things that unify them. They all have a cousin who's here, a brother who's there, etc., etc. So we got interrupted there. So where were we? They were often the glue of the elites. Everyone was a Junker or related to a Junker. So even if someone didn't own land, their older brother was a Junker who also knew someone else whose second brother was, and related to a media executive, etc., etc. So they're all related. It's a very marginal point; it won't come up, but it's just a good way of thinking about them. The last one was the media. Obviously, not every paper was the case. Every political party had its own paper. So the media is obviously very important for political reasons. Obviously, not every paper was right-wing. Every political party had its own paper. But of the other ones, the non-party affiliated ones, apart from one or two exceptions, the vast majority were controlled by members of the elite, because naturally it's very expensive and also profitable business to get into the media. Now, this means that the average newspaper had an anti-democratic bent because its ownership and therefore its editors were very much anti-democratic in their intentions. So stuff like the stab in the back myth really develops because there are such great supporters in the media. And this is used to slowly bleed public opinion away from democracy and lead to a couple of key assumptions against it, which Hitler will then use, as amongst so many others, to try and explain and justify and almost encourage people to vote for them. So the media can be used to slowly affect public opinion and turn them against democracy. So, what is the summary here? The elite clearly helped to destabilise democracy, but I would say, particularly up to 1930, do not actively intervene to destroy. And if you are going to argue this whole chunk in an essay, you need to make clear that when you are explaining how did the elite lead to Hitler, you are always saying there's two different phases. Phase one is up until 1930, which is not actively intervening, but, second bullet point, their existence is used to make the democracy look weak and slowly make people's opinion of democracy decline and slowly cause divisions in the left and cause there to be increasing cynicism towards democracy. And then as soon as phase two comes in, they are in a position, because of the failure of the 1918 revolution to actually get rid of them, to start messing stuff up pretty darn seriously, particularly those of the media, the industrialists, the army and Hindenburg. So in reality, there are two phases. The slow sort of eroding away they do between 1919 and 1930, and then the more active stuff, which we will have not covered in this part, because that's for a whole separate paragraph, lesson, video thing, because it's a lot more. We need to be a lot more detailed, because that's obviously directly testable. Thank you very much for listening. We will be covering next the economic problems and the culture. Until then, I will see you in the next video.